In the early and mid-2000s, Tokyopop built the foundation of the Western manga industry. And then in the early 2010s, both Tokyopop and their partner company, Borders Books, plunged themselves deep into the depths of bankruptcy. And if you're interested in learning more about that whole story, I have an entirely separate video about the rise and fall of Tokyopop. And it's during that video that I briefly mentioned that amidst all the ongoing problems that they were having in the late 2000s, like their finances and the loss of their Kodansha titles, that Tokyopop was also having troubles with their creators, specifically their original English language manga creators, or OELM creators. To get even more specific, well, it's a long story, and it involves the hubris of a company on the rise, it involves bad contracts, unfinished comics, and then the comic book industry all banding together to tell Tokyopop, wow, we had low expectations for you, but holy shit. Anyways, I know I told all of you that I'd make a separate video explaining the whole situation if there was enough interest in it, and, well, lo and behold, there was enough interest. And speaking of interesting, don't forget to stick around because I got a great deal for any of you who may be looking for a new VPN service out there. It's called Surfshark VPN. It has a whitelist feature, you can share your account with these, and if you click on the link in the description, you can get a 2-year plan for a little under $2 a month. Is that a great deal or what? But anyways, I'll tell you more about that later. For now, let's go ahead and get back to Tokyopop and its OELM creators. Let me tell you all about it. So, before I tell you about the goings-on of Tokyopop's OELM creators, let's go ahead and do a quick recap of who Tokyopop was, and more importantly, let's talk about all the troubles that they were having in the late 2000s. Like I said at the beginning, Tokyopop is basically the foundation upon which the English-speaking manga industry was built upon. In the early and mid-2000s, they dominated the new industry with a market share of at least 50%. They're the reason why we can buy manga in bookstores as opposed to just comic book stores. They're the reason we still get manga published in the original right-to-left format, and they also played an important role in the sudden burst of popularity anime was starting to get around that time. After all, they were making some of the time's most popular titles more accessible than ever. I mentioned this in my first Tokyopop video, but the founder of ICV2, Milton... God, I'm still not sure how to pronounce that, but anyways, he even went so far as to say that Tokyopop's expansion was the biggest factor in the boost in graphic novel sales in the early 2000s. But despite all their early success, alas, the Great Recession wasn't very kind to Tokyopop. In 2008, they'd start losing a significant amount of money, staff, and productivity, and then in 2009, they'd lose the rights to several of their best-selling titles when Kodansha announced that they were making their own US branch, rather than continuing to sell their manga through Tokyopop. And then, after one last year of failed efforts to pick themselves back up, the US and UK offices of Tokyopop filed for bankruptcy in the spring of 2011, leaving only their German offices active until their revival in 2015. But when they did announce their revival in 2015, they weren't exactly met with a lot of positivity, and that has a lot to do with how infamous Tokyopop had become for the way it was treating its OELM creators. So, that being said, to understand the problems between Tokyopop and those OELM creators, first we gotta understand how those creators came into working with Tokyopop in the first place. First, we gotta understand the rising stars of manga. In the advent of their meteoric success in the early 2000s, Tokyopop decided that between their bigger Japanese releases, they wanted to start publishing English comics too. Or more specifically, they wanted to publish what they were marketing as original English language manga, and these were pretty much exactly what they sound like. They're comics that are drawn and published in the style of manga, but they were originally written in English. If it helps, you can think of these as the manga equivalent of, say, Avatar: The Last Airbender or Voltron Legendary Defender, Same idea. Anyways, to that end, Tokyopop would start a contest called the Rising Stars of manga in 2002. The way it worked was that creators would send in 15 to 25 pages worth of their own original manga to Tokyopop, and the winners would get a cash prize, their pages published in an anthology, and perhaps most importantly, the first place winner would also get offered the opportunity to pitch their series to Tokyopop for a full-blown release. To absolutely no one's surprise, the contest went really well. It had thousands of entries, and its winner was a series called Devil's Candy by Priscilla Hamby and Clint Bickham, whose voice you actually might have heard in Air Gear, Gatchaman Crowds, Hitalia, or a good handful of other anime.
That's right! She's always been a weirdo ever since I was a kid! On Parents' Day in elementary school, she used to sit at a desk and pretend to be one of the students!
In any case, some of you watching this may actually know what Devil's Candy is, since it's been doing really well in recent years. But despite all the success it had, Devil's Candy never got published by Tokyopop. So, what happened? Well, I reached out to Clint, who said, quote, "It was a really fun experience altogether, and Tokyopop invited us to San Diego Comic-Con that year to talk about a possible publishing deal. Anyway, the contract wasn't very appealing, even to rookies like us, so we turned it down. It was a rights issue for us, though we didn't really see much opportunity to make money off of it either. We both stayed busy with professional work in the years that followed, so I think it was the right decision. Seeing where we are now, I can't imagine I would have been happy giving up the rights to Devil's Candy." So, basically what he's saying is, bad contracts and rights issues stood in the way of Devil's Candy getting published by Tokyopop. They didn't know it at the time, but my god, is that some eerie foreshadowing of the problems that Tokyopop was about to have. That said, let's go ahead and keep a pin in that for now, and let's talk about the next few Rising Stars of Manga contests. Despite Devil's Candy not getting a full publication through the old T-Pop, the contest still went well enough for Tokyopop to make it a yearly thing up until 2008. And a big part of its success was that aspiring comic creators saw this as an accessible way for them to get into the comic industry. Case in point, as time went on, first place winners were no longer the only participants in this contest whose comics would get their works published through Tokyopop. I mean, yeah, there were plenty of first place winners who would get published through Tokyopop, like Peach Fuzz and Van Von Hunter, but then there were also titles like Mark of the Succubus that also eventually saw publication through Tokyopop, even though they didn't win first place. As a matter of fact, Beezengast would go on to be Tokyopop's best-selling OELM, and it was the same way. It was entered under the name of Nikolai back in 2003, and it lost to Peach Fuzz. All that being said, though, I think this is where I should mention that although Rising Stars was a very large source for Tokyopop to get its OELMs, and at the very least it was definitely the most well-known, but it wasn't the only source they had. They also published a couple of works for pre-established comic creators like Ricky Simons and Chuck Austen, and they also recruited directly from SCAD. Or, well, you know, at least they did recruit from SCAD, past tense, because in 2008 they got banned since so many students and grads had been having negative experiences with them. Fun fact, by the way, the most famous person whose name has ever been attached to, god, anything that Tokyopop's ever done at all, probably, but especially its OELMs, was none other than Courtney Love. Yeah, as in lead singer of Hole and Kurt Cobain's wife. That Courtney Love. She co-wrote a series for Tokyopop called Princess Eye, and somehow the fact that she was involved still isn't the weirdest part about all this. Oh, and what is the weirdest part, you may ask? Well, that would probably be the identity of her co-writer, one DJ Milky, whose real name is Stu Levy. And who is Stu Levy, you may be wondering? Oh, you know, nobody too important, just the founder and CEO of Tokyopop. And to absolutely no one's surprise, this series was marketed a lot more generously than any of Tokyopop's other OELMs. I mean, check this out. It's got music videos, motion comics, action figures, the whole 9 yards. But I'm getting off topic. Back to Tokyopop. So all in all, at a glance, Tokyopop seemed to have a pretty good ecosystem going for their OELMs. But unfortunately, that ecosystem wasn't functioning as well as Tokyopop wanted people to believe, or more specifically, it wasn't functioning as well as Tokyopop wanted potential new creators to believe. The red flags were starting to appear as early as 2006, and the whole thing eventually blew up in Tokyopop's face in 2008. And that's kind of what I touched on earlier, you know, when the whole comic industry got together to dunk on Tokyopop. But to understand why the the problems in 2008 blew up in Tokyopop's face, first we gotta understand the criticisms Tokyopop had been receiving up until that point, because it's not like Tokyopop had a squeaky clean reputation up until then, and then suddenly, boom, people didn't like him. No. The loathing toward Tokyopop was something of a slow burn that finally became critical in 2008. And it was a slow burn made up of 3 key elements that I want to tell you about. Let's go ahead and start with... To be publishing an OELM for Tokyopop was to have absolutely no idea how long Tokyopop would allow your story to be. The target length for their OELMs was 3 volumes long, which is already short enough as it is, but there were several instances of people's stories either getting cut short, cancelled, or maybe even getting dangerously close to both or either of those. For instance, Amy Meberson said that Divalicious got canned after just 2 volumes because of fiscal reasons, despite the fact that the second volume had only been out for 4 months and hardly got any publicity, a problem that another one of Tokyopop's OELMs that ended prematurely, Sophie Campbell's The Abandoned, would have too. And there's plenty of other series that got suddenly cancelled too, of course, like there's Gyakushu, East Coast Rising, and King City, but let me tell you about 2 of the most well-documented cases of this happening. First, there's Chuck Austen's Boys of Summer. By the time the first volume hit North American shelves, he'd already finished all 3 volumes of it, but the cover was apparently risque enough to get it pulled from the shelves shortly after that first volume came out. And apparently, rather than just create a new cover and get this book that they'd already paid for into stores, Tokyopop sat on it for almost 3 years. But it did see a lot of overseas success despite all this, and so after a couple of years on sitting on 2 whole unpublished volumes, Tokyopop finally decided to release the whole series in North America as an omnibus. Or, at least that's what they were supposed to do, because shortly after it was supposed to come out, it got canceled pretty suddenly. Meaning, yes, it got canceled for a second time, and supposedly Tokyopop promised to publish it online instead, but Austen mentioned in 2011 that he doesn't believe they ever did that. And then there's Rivka's Steady Beat. In an interview with Publishers Weekly in 2006, Rivka said that her original plan for Steady Beat was to make it a full 9 volumes long, but by the time the interview was happening, she'd already cut it down to 4. Fast forward to 2008, she's already got about a third of that 3rd volume figured out, but Tokyopop's just not budging on their wanting her to make this the final volume. And the fact that she'd already started working on the 3rd volume despite this started so much confusion that Steady Beat was actually listed as cancelled for a while. Now, the good news is Steady Beat wasn't canceled per se, which is great, but the bad news is that the 3rd and almost certainly final volume wouldn't have a physical release. It'd be an online-only publication. And that's because while all this 3rd volume stuff was getting figured out, Tokyopop is getting split from that first big round of layoffs in June of 2008. I'm gonna be honest, I'm not sure if Tokyopop ever fully honored this promise of publishing that 3rd volume of Steady Beat online, because try as I may, I just couldn't find that 3rd volume anywhere. At the very least, I can confidently say that if it was ever available online at any point, 1, Tokyopop did an awful job marketing it, which seems to be kind of a trend for them, and 2, they did an even worse job of archiving it. But still, online availability or not, the fact that Steady Beat's 3rd and quite possibly final volume wouldn't get published in print was a disappointing blow to Rivka and her fans. As a matter of fact, she'd write a live journal post about the whole thing saying, quote, "All in all, I'm not very happy with the way Tokyopop has been running their business for a while now, not just with me, but as a whole, and I've been feeling for a while now that my own ethics line up with theirs less and less every day." And it's another one of her live journal posts that offers us a lot of insight into another one of those big problems Tokyopop had as a publisher. When it came to editors, Tokyopop was something of a mixed bag. I mean, there were some fantastic editors there, of course, some of whom would even go on to work at Marvel and DC. Alex DeCampi, for example, has been nothing if not vocal about how great her editors were. But then, every now and again, OELM creators would get stuck with editors who were negligent at best and seemingly out to sabotage the creators at worst. We're talking things like rude and completely completely unauthorized messages being left in books, and even taking early vacations during crucial times for the books they were supposed to be working on. You know, there's this really good piece on Comics Worth Reading from March of 2008. It's called Tokyopop OEL. Able to create a satisfying ending? Includes DramaCon 3 review. And the whole piece just talks about how a lot of Tokyopop's OELMs seemed completely absent of any editorial help. In response, Rivka made that LiveJournal post that I just mentioned, and she confirms everything that the article's writer, Joanna, had already guessed. That not everyone at Tokyopop received much, or sometimes even any help from their editors. In fact, she says that the first 2 volumes of Steady Beat received practically no editorial oversight. The scripts for the first 2 volumes of Steady Beat were sent back to her completely unedited, and the art received no feedback whatsoever. She got a new and much better editor for the 3rd and final volume of Steady Beat, yes, but by that point, those first 2 volumes had already been wrapped up. Either way, editorial issues are definitely pretty big issues, but unfortunately, these pale in comparison to this 3rd and final issue, and this is the one that Tokyopop became the most infamous for. But before I tell you about that, I wanted to pause real quick for just a moment, because I've been spending quite a bit of time now talking about the issues that plagued Tokyopop, and I think now's a good time to talk briefly about a good way to avoid issues of your own, namely internet security issues that can be easily avoided with this video's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. So this awesome little VPN here is so seamless and I love it. Check this out. You can just download it as an extension, you can set it to where you want to be, and boom! Japanese Netflix. I love this VPN because it has a whitelist feature. You can use it on your desktop computer or on mobile. You can have it running on multiple machines at once. And best of all, this VPN is an absolute bargain. And if you sign up for Surfshark now at surfshark.deals/redbard, then you can get 83% off of a 2-year plan and an extra month for free. So at that point, you're just paying $1.91 per month for a great VPN service. Again, that is surfshark.deals/redbard. I'll have the link in the description. So go ahead, get that sweet internet security and those even sweeter Japanese Netflix exclusives. And so, on that note, now that we've got that all figured out, let's go ahead and start talking about the 3rd and final issue of Tokyopops. Let me be blunt about something that's kind of been implied up until now, but I think it needs to be said plainly. Tokyopop was predatory toward a lot of their OELM creators. Let me paint you a picture. A very large portion, in fact, quite possibly the majority of their OELM creators were people who were new to the comic industry. These people know little or nothing about the industry. They don't even know what's normal and what's not, and most dangerous of all is that they got stars in their eyes. They want so badly to be making comics, and they finally feel like they got their foot in the door. And if you've ever been in a position like that, you know, where you finally land a dream job in your dream industry, then you know that it's so easy to ignore the contract you're under, and worse, it's even easier if the company you get a job at is as successful as Tokyopop was when most of these creators were getting signed on. I think Queenie-chan, the creator of The Dreaming, has a really great quote about this. She said in a piece for the Comics Journal in 2011, quote, "Living in Australia, I didn't have many, indeed, any other path to being published. So I signed with that contract because I wanted so much to be published and I felt that I had no other alternative. I went in with eyes wide shut." The point I want to make here is that Tokyopop was in a position where it was extremely easy to take advantage of a lot of their creators, and they did. And they did this through copyrights. So when you signed a contract with Tokyopop, you signed away half of the rights to whatever it was that you were creating, and the other half stayed with you. But unfortunately, I mean, you can't exactly do a whole lot with half a copyright to something, you know? Now, there were a few creators who were under different contracts with different copyright situations, but these were the vast minority of Tokyopop's creators. As a matter of fact, that same article from the Comics Journal that I just mentioned says that there were only 3. Now, when Tokyopop was fully operational and a series was getting published without much or any problems, only having half of a copyright wasn't all that much of an issue. But it became an issue when, say, Tokyopop closes down its US and UK branches, effectively putting several series into legal limbo. So all that being said, we can finally start talking about 2008 and when all these problems blew up in Tokyopop's face. That's right, it's finally time to talk about the Manga pilot program. In 2008, Tokyopop decided that it was finally time to bring their Rising Stars of Manga contest into the digital age. It was now being called the Shining Stars program, or more commonly, the Manga Pilot program. But even though the idea of this contest was still the same at heart, and that's to say that, it was make an original manga and possibly get it published by Tokyopop, there were still a couple of key differences, some of them good and some of them, well, appalling. Let's start with the good. Recognizing the success that non-first place winners had also been having in Rising Stars, the Manga Pilot program wasn't meant to be competitive. There was no first place, no second place, etc. Rather, the titles that would get chosen for publication were chosen based on the amount of community support that they were getting, and that would be measured based on the amount of engagement they were getting on a portal on Tokyopop's website where you could just read all the entrants. Okay? Yeah, that actually makes a pretty good amount of sense. So far, so good. But, of course, if everything made sense, well, I wouldn't be talking about it. Let's go ahead and talk about the appalling differences then, or rather, the pact that entrants were required to sign to enter the program. In language that I can only describe as, how do you do, fellow kids? Tokyopop told its potential creators that they would have to give up their series' moral rights. And moral rights is a fancy, and apparently French, way of saying your rights to the series. Leia Hernandez would call this the most childish and disingenuous legal document that she'd ever read. And she's not the only one who had something to say about this joke of a legal document. As a matter of fact, a lot of people had a lot of things to say about it. And sure enough, this is the part where several members of the comic book industry who hadn't even previously been involved with Tokyopop joined together to collectively talk about why this contract was so trashy. For example, there's responses from Brian Lee O'Malley.
I'm not going to speculate about where they're being untruthful. I'm just going to let them say what they're saying. It's bad enough.
Jen Wang.
I want to ask Tokyopop why they feel the need to do this. They could easily rise to the forefront of young adult comics publishing and offer great opportunities for new artists. Instead, they're shooting their reputation in the foot and losing respect one new evil move at a time.
And plenty more. As a matter of fact, there's a whole article on Comics Beat that's just full of quotes from comic industry members talking about why this contract was so bad. It was the issue of moral rights, it was the poor wording, the wildly expensive and unfair process through which you'd get arbitration if you needed it, and although it's not explicitly mentioned in this contract, it was revealed by Nikki Smith that the pay Tokyopop intended on offering was pretty bad too, that they were looking at paying a rate of $20 per page. Let me say that a little bit louder. $20 per page. That's $20 per completed page. Are you outraged yet? You should be. So then, how did Tokyopop respond to all this criticism? Well, the same way that all corporate machines do, by making a press release. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and read the whole thing to you because I don't think it's necessary, but I would like to read the first two sentences because I think that really sums up Tokyopop's attitude toward this whole situation. We've made the contracts generic to include as many creators as possible, and what you see is the same deal extended to everyone. We're proud to be able to present these contracts as they are, so love it or hate it, we've empowered potential manga creators to understand terms long before they propose a project. Wow! Okay, let's unpack that. So Tokyopop is basically sitting here saying, well, this is the contract we offer everyone, so, it's like, totally whatever. But it is, in fact, not totally whatever. But crucially, they're now blatantly admitting that this is what they've been offering creators for years. They're admitting that this is their normal. And this admission is, as far as I can tell, kinda what spurred people who hadn't already been hearing about the issues going on at Tokyopop to look more into everything going on over there. And all of this really did happen at the worst possible time it could have happened to Tokyopop too, because remember, during this same year, 2008, year of the Great Recession. Anyways, it's during this same year that Tokyopop is bleeding money, employees, and productivity too. To be getting awful PR on top of all that really is the cherry on top of the inevitable closure sundae. In any case, I've said all this, but I still haven't even told you about what became of the manga pilot program. Well, it encountered another roadblock, and that was Tokyopop's own website. To host these comics would require some pretty big changes to be made to the site, and alas, these changes weren't made in time. Jeremy Ross, Tokyopop's then director of new products, would say about this for Comics Talk, by the time we had the pilots queued up and ready to launch, we had no vehicle for doing it. We kept knowing the new website would be just around the corner, and it wasn't, so we decided in frustration that we would use the old website, bad as it was, as a workaround to get the pilots up. One of the bugs of this site was that it wasn't able to display the creators' names. And yet, despite all the criticism and eventually relieved technical difficulties, some entries were still uploaded on the site, but as far as I can tell, nothing really came of them, or at least nothing as far as Tokyopop was concerned. The media outlets that were talking about Tokyopop at the time had juicier things to talk about, things like their massive layoffs, so the death of the manga pilot program easily flew under a lot of radars, and so the program quietly faded away, destined never to be talked about again. Or, well, at the very least not until 2011. When Tokyopop shut down in 2011, they took the rights to pretty much all of their OELMs down with them. And that's to say that Tokyopop remained as a legal entity despite their closing, so they still had their half of the rights. But why hoard them at this point? They're literally just sitting there collecting dust. Well, according to Tokyopop, they weren't giving the rights back to their OELM creators because, well, they hadn't asked for them. Yeah, so on Twitter in July of 2012, Tokyopop said that, quote, "The creators need to come to Stu to get the rights back. He can't track them all down, and since they all have contracts, there will need to be some negotiations, but it's not like Stu won't give rights back at all." Yeah, famous last words before Stu didn't give rights back at all. Here's the thing. At this point, creators had already been trying to contact Stu. In fact, Alex DeCampi tweeted back to Tokyopop, "About 6 months ago, Stu was a blanket no when we asked to buy rights back. This has definitely changed." In fact, Stu himself also tweeted, "I have an open door. Any creator can come discuss with me whenever. Some have, many haven't." Alright, so where is the truth? Well, by 2012, some creators had approached Stu about negotiating for their half of the rights to their works back. And although there's not a lot of specific details out there, from what I can glean from people like Alex DeCampi and Chuck Austen talking about the matter, it was less like negotiating and more like Stu asking for unrealistic amounts of money and refusing to budge. And so there died pretty much all of Tokyopop's OELM series, or at the very least it put them in a state of legal purgatory that I don't really feel optimistic about them ever leaving. And although many of Tokyopop's creators would go on to be plenty successful and write several other new and fantastic series, hardly any of the titles that Tokyopop had once published would ever see any form of real closure. Honestly, the only series that would really see a happy outcome were Beezengast, which would eventually get finished thanks to Right Stuff, and the once cancelled King City, which would end up getting picked up by Image Comics. Everything else just kinda faded away. When Tokyopop announced that it was going to try to make a comeback in 2015, it wasn't exactly met with a lot of positivity despite the company's early success. In fact, in 2018, Stu Levy got invited to be a guest at Anime Expo, and there was so much backlash that Polygon wrote an article about it. So yeah, rest assured, people definitely haven't forgotten how scummy Tokyopop has been toward its OELM creators, least of all Ricky Simons, who said in response to Tokyopop's 2015 revival announcement, quote, "Tokyopop had one legacy, and that was lowering the bar for creators' rights." Now, unlike Tokyopop, I will give credit where it's due. They've acted as a springboard for several comic creators to get into the industry. And even if it wasn't a fully positive one, many of Tokyopop's former creators have talked about the value of that experience and how it's helped them. But still, springboard or not, Tokyopop still treated many of its creators unfairly, and I just really hope that Tokyopop's learned from all this and has their creators under better contracts now. Although, if I can be honest with you, it's kinda hard to feel optimistic about that knowing how Tokyopop's been in the past. To quote Simons again, "We don't know if Stu Levy intends to run Tokyopop the same way he did from 1998 to 2011, whether he intends to push rotting fish with roses attached under the noses of young, impatient, and inexperienced creators. We hope he's changed, but we sincerely doubt it." You know, I think the root of a lot of Tokyopop's problems in the mid and late 2000s, or at the very least their problems with their OELM creators, all stem from a very common criticism they received back then, and that's that they were trying to do too much, and in doing so, they were just spreading themselves out too thin. Cause you know, even though manga releases were their bread and butter, they were also publishing OELMs, they were publishing Korean manhwa, they were doing a few web series on MySpace and YouTube, and eventually they'd even try to run a reality show. But, you know, Tokyopop had a pretty limited pool of resources, and as we've seen, OELM creators who weren't making bestsellers were the ones who ended up getting the short end of the resources stick. If Tokyopop were only more willing or able to fully commit to their OELM library and its creators, I think a lot of these issues could have been avoided earlier on. Or, you know, Tokyopop also could have been more realistic about giving the OELM creators their rights back when it became apparent that Tokyopop wasn't gonna do anything with them, you know, that'd be pretty cool too. God, I honestly cannot stop thinking about how Courtney Love co-wrote a manga with Stu Levy. What a world we live in.